She said it with a teasing smile. Careful, boy. I might just steal your firsts. I laughed then, but I didn't realize she wasn't joking. Some firsts aren't taken. They're given quietly to the one who sees you before you even know who you are. It started the summer I moved into my new apartment. A quiet street, small balconies lined with hanging plants, and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. Except her, the woman who lived across the hall. Everyone in the building knew something about her, but never the same story twice. Some said she was divorced, some said she was waiting for her husband to come back, and a few whispered she was just too independent for anyone to stay. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that she had a calmness about her, like someone who had learned how to live with both beauty and loneliness. The first time we spoke, it was over something small, a delivery mix-up. I had received her package by mistake. When I knocked, she opened the door wearing a soft gray sweater and jeans, her long black hair falling over one shoulder. Her eyes, deep brown and slightly tired, studied me for a moment before softening into a half-smile. "Oh, that's mine," she said, glancing at the box in my hands. "Thank you, neighbor." I handed it to her, trying not to stare. "No problem. I just moved in, by the way." She leaned against the doorframe, one brow raised. "I figured. You've been fighting with the furniture for 3 days straight." I laughed, scratching the back of my neck. "Yeah, I'm not exactly good at assembling things." She smiled again, this time a real one, and for some reason, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I'm Elena," she said, offering her hand. I took it. Warm, steady. A simple handshake, yet there was something in the way her thumb brushed my knuckles. Unintentional, maybe, but enough to make my pulse skip. "Ethan," I replied. She nodded once, eyes still holding mine. "Welcome to the building, Ethan. Be careful, though." I frowned slightly. "Careful." Her lips curved, teasing. I have a bad habit of stealing firsts. I blinked, unsure how to respond. She tilted her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips, then closed the door gently before I could say anything else. For a while, I just stood there, staring at the door, at the echo of her words, and that playful look that lingered in my mind long after. Back in my apartment, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just her sense of humor. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was something deliberate about the way she said it. Not flirtation exactly, but awareness. Like she knew the effect she had and didn't apologize for it. That night, as I sat by my window, I could see her balcony from mine. The light inside her apartment glowed softly, and she was there, sitting alone with a glass of wine, hair untied, lost in thought. And that was the first moment I felt it. That strange pull towards someone older, wiser, and maybe a little broken, someone who seemed to know exactly who she was while I was still figuring out who I wanted to be. Days passed, but that first meeting lingered in my head like a song that wouldn't stop playing. Every time I stepped into the hallway, I half expected her door to open. Sometimes it did. Sometimes she'd just walk past, her perfume trailing behind her. Something faint and floral, impossible to forget. Elena had this way of filling silence without saying a word. She didn't need attention. It simply followed her. The quiet confidence, the unhurried movements, the kind of presence that made everything else fade for a moment. Our next real conversation happened in the lobby by accident. I was checking the mail. She was coming back from a jog, hair tied up, cheeks lightly flushed. She looked effortless, like someone who didn't try to look good, but always did. "Morning," she said, breathing softly as she pulled out her earbuds. "Hey," I replied. "You run every day?" She nodded, smiling faintly. "Old habit. Helps clear the noise." "From work?" I asked. "From life," she said simply, then chuckled. "You'll understand that when you hit 40. I grinned. "You don't look 40. She paused, giving me that same teasing look from before. "Careful, Ethan. Compliments can sound like invitations." I froze for half a second, unsure if she was joking. But then she smiled, a real one, and I realized she was teasing me, testing how easily I'd fluster. "I'll take that as a warning," I said, trying to play along. "Good," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Because I already warned you once." Her words carried weight, even when she spoke casually. There was always a double meaning hidden somewhere. Half humor, half truth. Later that evening, I found myself on the balcony again. She was there too, across from me, watering a few potted plants. I waved. She smiled and leaned on the railing. "Can't sleep?" she called out. "Not really," I said. "Too many thoughts." "About?" I hesitated. "Stuff. Life. Trying to figure things out." She nodded knowingly. "You'll be doing that for a while. The trick is to stop expecting the answers to make sense right away." Her voice carried across the quiet night, soft and calm, like she was sharing a secret instead of advice. We talked for almost an hour that night, about books, movies, little things we missed before the world got loud. She laughed often, not loudly, but in a way that felt private, like she didn't laugh that easily with just anyone. Before saying goodnight, she glanced at me one last time and said, "You know, Ethan, firsts aren't just kisses or touches. Sometimes they're moments you don't realize you'll remember." And then she disappeared inside, leaving me alone under the soft glow of the streetlight, heart steady, but mind spinning. That was the night I realized this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something quietly beginning, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. It was a Sunday afternoon when the line between neighborly talk and something deeper began to blur. The sun was high, warm light spilling through the hallways, and I could hear faint music coming from her apartment. Old jazz, the kind that made everything feel slower, softer. I was heading out with a book in hand when I noticed her door slightly open. Her voice called out, "Ethan, you're up early for a weekend." I turned, smiling. Couldn't sleep in. Thought I'd read at the cafe. She opened the door wider, dressed casually in a white linen shirt and faded blue jeans, her black hair tied in a loose bun. "You like coffee?" "Addicted to it," I said with a small laugh. She gestured toward her kitchen. "Then don't waste money. I make better coffee than that cafe downstairs." I hesitated just a second, then stepped inside. It was the first time I'd seen her apartment. It felt like her, elegant without effort. Books stacked neatly on shelves, soft colors, faint traces of vanilla and cedar in the air. "Nice place," I said quietly. She smiled as she poured water into a French press. "Thanks. Took me years to make it feel like home again." Her tone shifted just slightly, and I sensed the story underneath. A life rearranged after something ended. Divorce, maybe. The silence between us carried that truth without either of us needing to name it. As she handed me a cup, our fingers brushed. The touch was brief, but electric. She didn't pull back immediately, and neither did I. Her eyes met mine, steady, unreadable, before she turned away, pretending to focus on the coffee pot. "So," she said, voice lighter again, "what are you reading lately?" We ended up sitting by her window, sunlight spilling across the floor. I told her about my favorite authors, and she told me about hers. She talked about her 20s, about mistakes, cities she'd loved, people she'd lost. I listened, fascinated. She spoke like someone who had lived enough to know what truly mattered, and what didn't. At one point, she laughed softly. "You remind me of myself when I was your age. Hopeful. Always trying to make sense of everything too soon." I smiled. "And now?" "Now," she said, eyes glinting, "I just try to feel it instead of fix it." The way she said it, calm, wise, and yet quietly vulnerable, stayed with me. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. "Thank you for the company," she said softly. "It's been a while since I've had someone to talk to like that." I met her gaze and said, "Anytime." She smiled, slow, deliberate, with that same teasing edge. "Careful, Ethan. Keep showing up like this, and I just might start to expect it." I left with a strange mix of warmth and unease, realizing that what began as neighborly comfort was slowly becoming something far more personal. It was the middle of the week when something between us changed. Not suddenly, but with the quiet certainty of a tide coming in. I was fixing a loose shelf in my apartment when there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, she stood there holding a small plate covered with foil. "I made too much pasta," she said simply, her tone casual but her smile soft. "Thought you could help me finish it." I stepped aside. "That's an easy yes." She laughed, that low, warm sound that always seemed to loosen something in my chest, and walked in. She wore a light cream blouse tucked into jeans, barefoot, her hair down and slightly tousled. The smell of tomato and herbs followed her. We sat on the couch, eating from the same plate, talking about nothing and everything, how the rain always smelled better in summer, how she hated the silence after guests left, how I was still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. "You have time," she said gently, twirling the fork. "Don't rush it. You'll miss the good mistakes." "The good mistakes?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "The kind that teach you how to live, not how to avoid pain." Her eyes lingered on me after that, longer than they should have. The kind of look that said she'd seen enough of life to recognize something fragile when it stood in front of her. When the conversation quieted, she glanced around my apartment. "You're getting the hang of this place. It's starting to look lived in." "Mostly thanks to your advice," I said, smiling. She leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "You know, it's strange. I've lived alone for years, and I never noticed how much I missed this. Just talking, laughing, feeling someone here." Her words carried a tremor, not of sadness, but of truth. Before I could answer, thunder rolled in the distance, and rain began to fall, soft but steady. The sound filled the room, wrapping us in something calm and intimate. She turned toward the window, arms folded loosely. "Rain always makes me nostalgic," she murmured. "Reminds me of the days when love still felt new." I hesitated, then said quietly, "Maybe you can again." Her head turned slightly, eyes meeting mine, deep dark, searching. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, saying nothing. Then she smiled barely. "You really shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because," she whispered, "you don't know what they do to me." The room felt smaller then. Not because we'd moved, but because everything unspoken between us suddenly had weight. Her breath caught, so did mine. She stood, collecting the empty plate, but her hand brushed my shoulder as she passed. Light, deliberate, and far too meaningful for something accidental. When she reached the door, she paused. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "You made the rain feel less lonely." And before I could think of what to say, she was gone, leaving behind the faint smell of her perfume and the growing realization that this was no longer just friendship. Something was shifting, and neither of us could pretend not to feel it anymore. That Friday evening, the building felt unusually quiet. Most of the neighbors were away for the weekend, leaving only the soft hum of distant traffic and the faint golden light of sunset streaming through the corridor windows. I wasn't expecting anyone when a knock echoed on my door, gentle, familiar. When I opened it, there she was again, Elena. A white shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders, her dark hair slightly damp from the evening air. She held a small bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Peace offering," she said lightly. "For talking too much last time." I smiled. "You can talk as much as you want if it comes with wine." Her laugh came soft, and something in her eyes flickered. Maybe amusement, maybe hesitation. "I'll remember that." She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the room as though taking quiet comfort in its familiarity. We sat by the window, where the city lights shimmered in the distance. The first sip of wine warmed the air between us, and conversation flowed, easy, gentle like it always did. But beneath every laugh and shared memory, there was an undercurrent we both felt yet carefully avoided. At one point, she asked, "Do your parents ever visit?" I shook my head. "They live up north. We talk, but not often." She nodded slowly. "It's strange, isn't it? How people can love us and still feel so far away." Her voice softened, her gaze distant. I wanted to ask more, but something in her eyes said she was already far enough inside that thought. "You must have been lonely," I said quietly. She turned to me, smiling faintly, the kind of smile that hides a truth you don't want to speak aloud. "Sometimes, but loneliness isn't always sad. It teaches you how to listen to yourself." We fell silent after that. The kind of silence that's heavy but comforting. The kind that makes you aware of every heartbeat. Outside, rain began to fall, slow, deliberate drops tapping against the window pane. She looked at it and whispered, almost to herself, "Funny how the rain always comes when I'm not ready for it." Without thinking, I said, maybe it comes to remind you that not everything that falls apart is a tragedy. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw something break open inside her, not in pain, but in recognition. You say things, she murmured, that people my age stopped believing a long time ago. I guess I haven't lived long enough to stop believing yet. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Don't lose that, please. The room glowed in warm light, rain whispering outside. She reached forward, adjusting the glass in my hand, her fingers grazing mine, lingering just a heartbeat too long. That single touch carried more emotion than a dozen words could. I should go, she said finally, standing slowly. Before I forget how to. I wanted to stop her to say stay, but I didn't. I just nodded, quietly watching her gather herself. At the door, she turned, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, some firsts aren't meant to be stolen. They're meant to be remembered. Then she was gone, leaving me with the echo of her words, the taste of wine, and the ache of something that had almost become love. The night it happened wasn't planned. It never is. Sometimes the most unforgettable moments begin quietly. A knock on the door, a look held too long, a heartbeat you can't ignore. It was raining again, heavier this time. Thunder rolled through the sky, and the power had gone out across the block. I was sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the small candles I'd found in a drawer. Then came that soft, unmistakable knock. When I opened the door, she was standing there, Elena, soaked from the rain, hair clinging to her cheeks, eyes glistening with something I couldn't quite name. She held her phone in her hand. The power's out. My apartment's freezing. Mind if I stay for a while? I stepped aside without a word. She entered, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. Her perfume mixed with the scent of rain, intoxicating, grounding. She sat by the candlelight, wrapping her arms around herself. I swear this weather's testing my patience, she said softly, laughing under her breath. I handed her a towel and watched her dry her hair, slow, methodical, almost absent-minded. You look like you've been running through a storm, I said. Maybe I was, she replied quietly, her eyes locking with mine. Something unspoken passed between us then. That familiar tension we'd both been dancing around for weeks. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. Two people standing on opposite sides of a line neither of them drew, but both wanted to cross. She looked at the flickering candle and murmured, You ever notice how quiet it gets when the power's out? Like the world just stops watching for a bit. I smiled. Maybe it's giving us permission to be honest. Her gaze lifted to me, soft, uncertain, vulnerable. Honest about what? I took a breath. About how hard it's been pretending not to feel something when it's so obvious. The silence that followed was deafening. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched me like she'd been waiting for that sentence all along. Then she stood up, slowly, and walked toward me. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath. Maybe not, I said, but I know what I'm feeling. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, she almost smiled. You're too young to understand what comes after this, she said, echoing her old warning. The one that once felt like teasing, now trembling with sincerity. Then let me find out, I murmured. The thunder cracked outside, a sudden burst of light illuminating her face. The fear, the longing, the pull she was fighting. She looked at me, eyes glistening, lips parted to say something that never came. Instead, she whispered, You have no idea what line you're standing on. And before I could answer, she turned, walking toward the door, her figure bathed in candlelight, every step heavier than the rain outside. The door clicked shut. I stood there, the storm howling around me, realizing that sometimes the scariest thing isn't losing someone. It's realizing how close you came having them. Morning arrived slow, like the world was exhaling after holding its breath all night. The storm had passed, leaving everything washed clean, streets glistening, leaves trembling with dew, and the air sharp with the scent of rain. I barely slept. My thoughts spun in loops. Her voice, the way she looked at me before leaving, that trembling whisper, asterisk, you have no idea what line you're standing on. Asterisk, she was right. I didn't, but I knew how it felt to be on that line, pulled between what was right and what felt too real to deny. When I finally stepped outside, the neighborhood looked softer, quieter. The world felt strangely new, as if something had shifted, even though nothing visible had changed. I caught sight of her apartment, curtains drawn, light off, and for a moment I thought about walking over, about saying the words that had been building inside me since that night. But then I saw her. Elena was sitting on her porch steps, a mug of coffee in her hands, her long black hair tied loosely, a light sweater draped around her shoulders. She looked different, tired but peaceful. When she noticed me, she smiled, that small, knowing smile that seemed to speak in full sentences. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not really." "You mean neither?" She patted the step beside her. "Sit for a minute." I did. The quiet between us was comfortable, a strange mix of tension and calm. Birds chirped distantly, puddles rippled from the breeze, and the warmth of the morning sun felt almost like forgiveness. "I shouldn't have come over last night," she said finally, eyes on her coffee. "I knew better. I've always known better." "I didn't mind," I said softly. "I just wish you'd stayed." Her eyes lifted to mine, gentle but firm. "That's exactly why I couldn't." The truth in her voice hit harder than anything. She wasn't rejecting me. She was protecting me, maybe from her own feelings as much as mine. There was something beautiful about that kind of restraint, the quiet kind of love that doesn't need to be claimed to be real. She set her mug down and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "You remind me what it felt like to be seen again. Not for what I lost, but for what's still left." I swallowed hard, unsure what to say. The vulnerability in her voice was something sacred, fragile, real, and human. "I just didn't expect you to see me the way you do," she continued. And that scared me. The breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from her garden. I looked at her, really looked at her, and it struck me that maybe love doesn't always mean possession. Sometimes it's about the space between two people who understand what they can't have, yet choose to care anyway. "I get it," I said finally. "Some things aren't meant to happen, but they're still meant to matter." Her eyes softened, glimmering in the sunlight. "Exactly." We sat there a while longer, saying nothing. Just two people who'd crossed paths in the quiet corner of life, where timing was imperfect, but connection was undeniable. As I stood to leave, she reached out, a brief touch on my hand, warm and grounding. "You'll find someone who doesn't have to stop herself," she said softly. I smiled. "And you'll find someone who doesn't make you want to." She laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Walking away, I realized something she'd once said was true. Some firsts aren't stolen, they're given. And though the story didn't end in the way I imagined, it ended where it needed to, with understanding, not regret.